Okay, everybody, welcome to the Hard Sell with me, your host, Joel Stevenson. Sales is hard, and in the podcast, what we're trying to do is bring leading experts in the field of sales to help demystify sales a bit and help you achieve better sales outcomes. Today, we're welcoming to the show Amanda Rice. Amanda is currently VP of Sales at Anvyl. Prior to that, she was a senior director of sales at Power School Group. And then before that, she spent almost 5 years at Schoology running both sales and sales operations. And also worth noting that she is a badass golfer, so don't bet her on the golf course. You might regret that. So, Amanda, welcome to the Hard Sell.
Thanks, Joel. I appreciate the warm introduction. And yeah, that's correct. I would not bet me in golf, especially if I'm playing off the ladies' tees. I can destroy pretty much anyone if you let me play off the forward tees.
Yeah, well, just noted if we ever end up on the course together, I'm going to bear that in mind. You'll be off the blacks, I think. While I'm off the early tees. Well, it's great to have you here. Maybe it just give us a little bit of background, maybe on what Anvyl does, or in a little bit more about your background and maybe anything that I missed.
Yeah, of course. So as Joel mentioned, I recently joined Anvyl. It's been about 90 days at this point. So I came to the Anvyl organization through, part of my network. So someone that I worked with previously at a finance company. I had never heard of Anvyl. They're a smaller startup, and they focus in on supply chain, which was not my background previously. And so in the supply chain world, obviously it's a really hot area today, but where we support organizations is from issuing a PO through following up with those suppliers and managing that process of the inbound supply chain to delivering kind of those goods. And so it's interesting because Anvyl solves a key issue that no other solution out there in the market solves for today. So I was really excited to join that and obviously learn about supply chain given how hot of a topic it is. But as Joel mentioned, like my background is not in supply chain. So previously I've spent 10 years in sales leadership and at SaaS organizations. But that experience has always been with companies that are in different industries and spaces. So prior to Anvyl, I was at Schoology, which was then acquired by Power School, which is in the education technology space. And then before that, I was in the medical space selling to doctors so they could book appointments online at ZocDoc. And then prior to that, I was working at an organization that sold PR and marketing software. So I think the one really interesting thing, if you look back at my leadership experience, is it was at a variety of SaaS software organizations, but all different industries. And then during my time at Schoology, I had the opportunity to go from leading sales teams to even managing things like sales operations, as well as a small time on sales enablement. And so, interesting kind of perspective versus someone that's just been in a sales leadership type of position, whether you're a VP of sales or managing a sales team. It's a little bit different, I think, to see both sides as well as to see it across different industries.
Yeah. Well, maybe let's start with the industry side of things. So it's hard. I mean, I think education has such its own rhythm that it works in, and I think if I remember right, you were selling into secondary schools. Is that right?
So we would target the school districts. And so basically any school that would be a part of that district. So whether it's elementary or, middle school, high school could purchase it. So obviously there's also a whole segment around colleges and universities, but our focus was in the K-12 space.
Right. And so like if you were to think about maybe like two polar opposites of the world, I think about like the school district that I grew up in suburban Chicago and sort of how they were probably set up versus like, somebody like a Thrasio that you maybe work with now or would be sort of in your strike zone at Anvyl. It's like hard to imagine two different types of organizations. So maybe just talk a little bit about like the different, like how you have to approach those differently from a selling perspective.
Yeah. So one thing that was interesting with school districts is, there's a lot of RFP volume, especially for the larger districts that we would work with. Today at Anvyl, we target smaller companies, typically below like 500 million in revenue. And so we don't see like an RFP process as frequently. Obviously, as you move up market into more enterprise organizations, that does shift a bit. So I think a piece of it is kind of who we're targeting today. So luckily, I don't have to deal with really RFPs anymore. So that's a big difference. The other thing that's like fascinating is, finding contacts and like who you're going after from a sales rep perspective. Let's say you're that SDR doing outreach, to go to a school website to find the information. Like that's where our SDRs spent all of their time previously, was on school websites, because the information was public and it was available. Versus, in the supply chain world and in companies, everyone's on LinkedIn. And so they're spending a lot more time looking through LinkedIn versus going to someone's website to find who the right contact is. And so it's interesting because even like from the upfront part of the sales process, I think things look very different in terms of where the team is spending their time and trying to understand like who they're contacting and targeting. And then looking through like, what does that, sales process look like? So now like once you've set up a meeting from there, things are actually pretty similar, surprisingly. So like, we run intro calls, then a demonstration happens, they go through a deeper evaluation, they may want to do a trial, all similar things to what we saw in the education space. But the other thing that's drastically different, and for me, it's been a big adjustment, is understanding like the vocab. So in the education space, I remember when I started there, I didn't know much at all. Like there was what we call standards-based grading or mastery grading. And when I went to school, you either got like an A or an F, right? So I remember starting at Schoology and having to learn all of this like new lingo. It was very similar as I stepped into the supply chain space. Trying to understand like what does this language mean, and then how do I understand what their process looks like and how we support them. And so that's been a key difference, is trying to figure out how can I support the sales team and ramp up my knowledge there as quickly as possible, when I don't necessarily have that area as background. So definitely, like if you're looking to switch industries, that would be something that's I would call out, as you're trying to understand like what does that process look like, and how are you communicating to people.
And what do you think is the best place to go, like quickly get smart about a new group of customers? Is it, industry publications? Is it talking to the existing sales team, or doing other forms of research? Or what do you find is tends to be the best way to get up to speed fast?
So talking to the existing sales team and our customer success team has been really helpful for me. A key piece that I've been trying to focus in on is like, why do clients buy and what are the core kind of value props that we do offer? And then identifying like industry experts in-house. And I'm not the only person on the team that doesn't come with a supply chain background. So trying to figure out how do we not only train myself, but other members of the team, right, with that knowledge. And then personally, I've started to look for podcasts. So, similar to the one that we're on today, there's a lot of great podcasts on supply chain. So trying to follow those, read up on industry news to try to start to understand some of the lingo. And then obviously, like, don't be afraid to Google something when you're on a call and you're not familiar with it, or ask questions. And so, for me, I think having that curiosity factor, not being afraid to ask for information, has been really helpful for me to suck down knowledge, as I've transitioned from one industry to another.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I spent a little bit of time in supply chain myself a long time ago, and supply chain is also an industry like versus sales where there's a lot of I'd say like there's a lot of literature about sales. Like you can go to Amazon and buy a lot of sales books, but there aren't necessarily a lot of sales textbooks. Isn't taught in schools as much, but increasingly supply chain does seem to be taught in schools. A lot of schools have like industrial distribution programs or things like that. So that for whatever reason, there seems to be more of a textbook base of supply chain for whatever reason. So I don't know that's like necessarily a go-to for sales, but it just sort of strikes me that like there isn't really the textbook for sales, versus like there are actually some textbooks on the supply chain side.
Yeah, no, I've been fortunate. Like even Supply Chain for Dummies exists, and so starting to flip through that. Also, one other great resource for me has been like our CEO. He was in supply chain for years, and so he's more than open and willing to share information and help me suck down knowledge. And so again, I think it's identifying like the right resources for you, so you can go and kind of get that knowledge a little bit on your own, but then also work with people within the organization. So.
Yep. Yeah, makes sense. Okay. So maybe just switching gears a little bit, let's talk about, you've got this interesting background where, Yeah, I think you're maybe seeing it more now just due to the way that sales is becoming a little bit more digital, a little bit more quantitative. But historically, you didn't see this that much where you had people that were operations people and then you had people that were sales leaders, and there wasn't as much crossover between the two. You would typically see people go sort of up one path or the other, and then there was this sort of symbiotic relationship between the two. And I think that does exist still today in many orgs. But you've done both jobs, and so I mean, maybe start by saying, like, if you're like, I'm curious, like, what you think the sales leader needs to know about the operations leader and what the operations leader needs to know about the sales leader in order to work most effectively together.
Yeah, so it's interesting because I think one thing to keep in mind is like it's a partnership and each of you can learn from each other, right? And so there are going to be strengths that sales leader brings to the table that a sales operations person may not necessarily have. Even looking at myself with my leadership team today, I'm not always necessarily like a rah like kind of person, but like I've got some strong people on the team where those are their strengths. I do try to build team dynamics and stuff, but I'm not as much of like a rah person, right? And so knowing what are those people's strengths and leveraging that within the team, I think is really important first to kind of build that partnership. And then the other piece that has been helpful for me over the years, I've always been taught from kind of day one, there's an art and science to sales. And so for some people, your strength may be that art, like in front of customers, like the conversations that you're having and how you're kind of driving things towards those next steps, or how you objection handle and manage kind of those types of conversations. But then the science behind things and leveraging that data is where you're going to build a repeatable machine. And so instead of getting lucky and having like a big win here or like one good quarter, as a sales leader, it's our job to build consistent, repeatable, and stackable, right? Like growth over periods of time. And so in order to do that, I think that's where a sales ops type of person can come to the table and not only provide some of the data that you need, but also the process to help things become more repeatable. And ideally, someone who's really strong in that role, they can help break things apart and identify that stuff for you. So that may not be like your strength to isolate and figure out like what are the right processes and what are the best data points to look at. But ideally, that other person could help support you there.
Right, right, makes sense. And the other thing that I've sort of seen is um, the there's a little bit of a change now in who's leading sales organizations, and particularly as you look at some of the SMB or like higher velocity sales organizations. I think those leaders tend to be a lot more quantitative now than they used to be, versus like enterprise. You still have a little bit of like where the person that's running the sales organization is also the person that was the best salesperson, because the bigger the deal is, the higher it gets sort of passed up the food chain. And so your sales leader is spending a lot of time with customers closing deals, versus in an SMB world, your sales leader is spending a lot of time working with sales managers, sales ops, like not a lot of time with customers, just because like it's the juice isn't worth the squeeze, if you will. So I'm curious if you've like where do you where do you guys fall at Anvyl? Are you is more of an enterprise process, or what is your sort of motion look like there?
Yeah, so at Anvyl today, it's more in the SMB and mid-market space, where at Schoology, it was SMB, mid-market, and enterprise. And it's interesting because like that was one of the things, because I was process oriented and I came from an inside background, it was one of the fears that they had putting me into that type of role where the enterprise was still, such a big part of the organization. They were almost concerned that I would implement too much process, right? And so where in the Anvyl world, they're like starving for process because it is so much SMB and mid-market, and they're smaller organizations still building that. And so that is one of the key strengths that I've been able to bring to the table. But I think the interesting thing is even in an enterprise world, there is some level of process and repeatability that you can create. And so like I definitely agree with you that in the SMB mid-market space, I think you're seeing even more of it. But I've been surprised by how much I've been seeing of it over the years in the enterprise space as well, too.
Yeah, I think that at some level, it seems like people have now been forced to reckon with the fact that, whether you want to be in person or not, it's not really possible. And the remote selling or, inside selling world has always been a little bit more quantified in digital. And so now we're able to sort of figure out that even if you're running a long sales process, there's characteristics we can pick up in the selling process about like how many people are you talking to and like how deep are your conversations with these folks and how long has it been since the last conversation and when's the next meeting, like that type of stuff. So it seems like whereas like when I first started in selling, it was a lot about the the Rolexes and the steak dinners. That I don't see as much of that anymore.
Yeah, no, that's completely true. I mean, also, I feel like as the pressure continues to increase around forecasting, so, if you're a publicly traded company too, I was fortunate enough to go through the process at Power School where we IPO'd. And so that forecasting motion is also really important. And so the only way to get that is to have a strong partnership with the sales ops team and understand your data and how to run that process. And so I've also seen that as well, even at that type of level. So depending upon where the company's at, I think stage wise also has an impact as well.
Yeah, and so maybe talk a little bit more about that. Were you guys using sort of? I'm guessing from your statement that you weren't just taking salespeople at their words about what the numbers were going to be. That you had some additional ways of trying to verify pipeline and what was really going to come in a given quarter. Is that fair?
Yeah, there was probably like 5 to 10 ways to almost consistently like triangulate the data. Some of it was, predicting out based upon stages and leveraging like weighted forecasts. There was forecast categories that we used. There was a weekly deal review for 90 minutes on Fridays. And it wasn't just a deal review. It was also like each manager's call was basically validated on that meeting as well. And we were also all responsible for submitting a forecast in the system. And so, there was things like what's called a deal blitz, which was basically 3 times a quarter, every rep without seeing any of the details on the opportunity other than the name of the opportunity. What's your gut feel? Is this a yes or a no? And so there was just constant ways to continue to like triangulate the data. And we basically had a control book that we leveraged. And so it's interesting because, even though Anvyl's a smaller organization and while we're not publicly traded, I'm trying to figure out like what are the right pieces of that type of puzzle that you could leverage for a smaller team, right? And to continue to drive that level of accountability and start to understand like, well, what does my sales math look like you from an individual rep perspective and how am I going to perform, right? And so I think it's also interesting of like, how can you take some of those practices from a much larger organization and start to apply them to even a smaller organization to use them as well to start driving that repeatable, consistent success and accountability across the team.
Yeah, I'm curious about the sales blitz concept. Like how accurate was that? Did you find that the reps generally had a good sense of what was going to close or not, or did they often err either on the side of over or under confidence?
It was typically overconfident in general is what I
Oh,
found
that's shocking.
from perspective. Shocker. Exactly. And so I think the interesting thing there, though, is even though it was over, I knew that it had to be over what I was calling from a forecast perspective. I'm like, if it was under, something was like drastically wrong in my eyes. The other
Yeah.
piece that was really helpful was like, so if they called something as being a yes, but then let's say it wasn't even an upside in their forecast categories, or maybe there was no price associated with it, like how are you calling this as a yes and you haven't even potentially discussed price with them yet? And so it could also be a way to like help kind of drive pipeline conversations and management. So there were some interesting ways to leverage the data set as well.
Yeah, it's interesting, and so it was people were pretty consistent at least in terms of being overconfident. It wasn't like it swung wildly, but it was sort of maybe a quick way to sort of say, as you said, it's like if like they could that would very quickly expose whether there was something in their head that was not reflected in the data systems, like their CRM or whatever you were using.
Yep. Yeah. So for instance, also like if they said no on a deal, but they had it in forecast, which is our highest category of like this deal's coming in, they'd basically committed it to the business. But you said no on the deal blitz, like something's wrong, right? And so
Yeah.
again, it's just another way to kind of like validate some of the data sets.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting. And what about, did you guys look at or in current or past jobs, have you looked at any of the engagement data as also a signal or no?
When you say engagement data, are you talking about rep engagement, like customer engagement on calls?
Yeah,
That's what I'm following when you say engagement.
yeah. So customer engagement, so like signals that are coming from the customer about like how many emails are going back and forth, or how long they're spending in a meeting, or when's the next meeting, that type of stuff.
So I have not been able to successfully probably get to that level of granularity. We currently use Chorus today, and so we're starting to look more at some of those data sets and get things set up there as well as like with outreach. But I don't feel like I've ever seen us truly run that extremely well yet at an organization I've been a part of. So definitely some work to do there, but it's stuff that I would like to build towards.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's I mean, I suppose in our experience, there's a lot of false positives can be thrown from that data as well. But there tends to be, I think, similar to the way you were describing the deal blitz notion. There's like some really simple ones, which is, if somebody has a deal in, in sort of the commit stage or whatever your top stage is, but there hasn't been an email inbound from the customer in like 10 days, there's probably something wrong.
Exactly.
In that sense. And I think a lot of times what we've seen is that actually the very simple metrics are the ones that end up being pretty predictive versus like these elaborate sort of black box, sentiment and other things. I don't know that we've, as an industry, if we've really cracked the code on that yet. So I don't think you're far behind.
Well, that's good to hear. We're always working to get better, and so always trying to figure out what else is happening out in the space too that we may be missing out on and have not necessarily thought about. So,
yeah. Well, we're starting to run towards the end of our time here. I'm gonna see if anybody in the audience has questions. But while we're waiting for any questions to queue up, what's the best way if you want to learn more about Anvyl or if they want to be in touch? What's the best way to do that?
yeah, so two ways I'd say. One, we've got an Anvyl sales email address, so you're welcome to reach out to sales@anvyl.com if once you've had a chance to review the website. I'm also on LinkedIn, so pretty easy to find. Amanda Rice, and VP of Sales at Anvyl. So happy to connect there as well.
Okay, great. I'm just checking to see. It doesn't look like we've got any questions, so we will let you off the hook here. But actually, we do have one stand by. Chris, go ahead.
Well, thank you so much. I'm Chris Rossetti in San Francisco. A lot of great information here. Thank you for letting me speak. I have a quick question. Is that okay?
Yeah, go ahead.
Great. I work for a small paper company, Dunder Mifflin. And I'm just kidding. I was a sales rep for many years for a gourmet food distributor on the East Coast. And I noticed that when my sales were doing quite well, when my route, if you will, my clients, the grocery stores I was calling on, when I was doing real good, it seemed like they cut my route, split it, and gave it to other salespeople and caused me to build up again. That was an aggravation on my part. I guess the thinking on their part was, I'll make it because, I know how to sell. Is that the culture today? I did this many years ago. I'm wondering if that's the culture in your company or other companies to where a sales rep is rewarded by having their client base cut, if you will, because they know they'll make it. Just curious. Thank you.
Yeah, interesting question. Amanda, why don't you take that?
Yeah, I mean, the way in which I see territories is like if you've had success in the territory, like let's try to keep you there as much as possible because I agree like those relationships that you've built can continue to expand. I think the question is, was the business, like let's say potentially you started with 2,000 clients, right? And now all of a sudden the business cuts it down to 1,000. Is that because, you're struggling to kind of potentially reach and maintain everyone? And so maybe that's the case that drives other people potentially into the territory as well. And so I've seen shifts and kind of changes like that. But one thing that I found is like the longer you can keep someone in a territory, the better. But I also have seen, there may be an opportunity where from a business perspective, you're having so much success like in that territory. And so is there a way to leverage you in other markets that are potentially, underperforming where you could help kind of get that market up and running? So I've also seen that approach as well too. So I think it would probably depend upon the broader context within the organization and ideally thinking through like how do you manage and drive that type of change? I think getting buy-in and helping you as a rep understand the why behind it, I think would be really important in terms of communicating that. And so those would be things that I would think about from a sales leadership perspective on like, why are we making the change and how do we communicate it to Chris and the team to make sure you're set up for success?
Well, thank you so much for the insight. Yeah, it seemed I was given the troubled stores, the troubled clients, the troubled accounts, and turned them around. And once I got them built up pretty strong and good relationships and good numbers, it was like, okay, we need to move you on to here. It was frustrating, but it's good to hear it might have been a reward, actually.
Yeah, that's I think one thing that's tough for a company to balance is sort of what the company needs to achieve relative to what the reps need to achieve. So you can think about a world where you've got a company and a single rep. The rep gets all the deal flow. The rep, makes as much money as sort of possible. At some point, the rep probably gets too busy, and you've got to cut the territory in half. And when you cut the territory in half, the rep, probably there's a bunch of stuff that the rep couldn't get to, but the rep's able to optimize amongst all the possible opportunities that sort of maximizes their individual outcome. Now they can't do that anymore. Now they've got to dip a little bit deeper into sort of the next tier down to try to drive some revenue. And so there's always this tension between trying to maximize the potential of the company, but also trying to make the individual territory sort of good enough for a rep to be able to make the sort of money that they want to make. And there is some people think of sales in that way as in some ways a zero-sum game, in that if you've got a bunch of reps that are doing super, super well and making tons of money, then a lot of times the next year the comp plan changes, right? Because most companies have an idea of what they think they want to pay or what they can afford to pay. And as people start to blow it out, then there's changes. So it's an interesting question, and one that I think Amanda's exactly right. Like, the best thing you can do is communicate the why and help people understand why these things are being done. Hopefully there's good long-term alignment via equity or other things that everybody can sort of get on the same page. So thanks for the question.
And thank you.
Okay, well, I think that's it, Amanda. So thanks so much for being on the show, and we'll look forward to chatting with you again soon.
Thanks for the invitation, Joel. I appreciate it.
Okay, take care.
Have a great day.
Bye.